Okay, so today we're starting a new chapter, right? Chapter 10, we've skipped over the formal logic material because we just don't have the time to get to it. And what we're looking at are inductive arguments. So what do you remember? Think back to earlier chapters. What do you remember about inductive arguments? Let's start with what you actually do know. What you can recall.
They were strong or weak.
Okay, that's very good. They're either strong or weak, as opposed to what?
The valid or invalid.
Right, as opposed to valid or invalid. And what does that mean? Valid or invalid is like the light switch. You flip it on or you flip it off, and there's no in between. What about strong and weak? That's more like what? It's not so much like a on-off light switch. You remember the metaphor that I had? It's like a dimmer switch. You can be stronger or weaker. What else do you know about inductive arguments? What else can you say about them? Yeah.
They're only to some of the time, I think, kind of like.
Yeah, you're on the right track. Keep going with that.
I lost my train of thought now.
They're only right some of the time, even if they are strong. What does that mean? They're only right some of the time. Then
they have a general rule.
Yeah, they use general rules. Well, let's go a little bit further. General. With what Ms. Bell was saying. So if they're only right some of the time, then they're what some of the time? Wrong some of the time, or they don't hold all the time, which means they can have exceptions. And that doesn't mean necessarily that they become a bad argument. If you start piling up a lot of exceptions, then yeah, right, it turns into a bad argument. But if we make a generalization like, if somebody studies for the class, they will probably do well in the class. Could there be exceptions? Can you think of cases where somebody might actually study well for the class, but that doesn't necessarily lead to them doing well? What could be some exceptions? Yeah.
They could they could study well, but they could cram it into a certain amount of time. Like they would assume that they study well.
Yeah, they could be mistaken about whether they are studying well. Maybe they have test anxiety. They show up to the test and suddenly they choke. That happens to some students, unfortunately. I remember when I was first teaching here, I had a guy who took the class with me several times, and each time that he would take it, he would do worse. And I was really surprised, and it turned out, what was the problem? He had a problem taking tests. So once we actually put him in a separate room and gave him all the time he needed, he knew all the stuff. It was like the pressure of, got to get this done in 50 minutes. So that there can be exceptions to them. Now there's a lot of different types of inductive arguments, and we've looked at some of them so far. What we're going to look at in this chapter are a few of those, and we're going to look at them more carefully. So this is all stuff to keep in mind as we're going through this. And your book starts out talking about two closely related ways of arguing, inductive arguments. So if you're thinking about general, what's the opposite of general? It's specific, right? We have a general rule that applies to specific cases. Each of you must take the final exam if you want to pass the class. Again, there could be some exceptions, right? Oh, my child was terribly sick and I couldn't come to class. Well, that may happen with some people. Not any of you don't have children, of course, but your specific case is an instance of a general rule. And we can talk about going from the general to the specific. We reason this way, don't we? If you study for the class, you'll probably do well in the class. You actually do study for the class, you're one of those students, therefore you will probably do well. You're going from a general rule to a specific case. Well, if you can do that, you can also go from specifics to something more general, can't you? Think about, for example, how do you know? How did you actually come to the conclusion that generally students who study for a class do well in the class? Did you look at every single student in the world? I mean, could you? I can't, unless you were God, you know, or some sort of super alien monitoring being. What did you go by? How did you come to that conclusion then? Because it is a right conclusion, isn't it? Where did the force of that come from?
A lot of teachers tell you that if you study, then you do well.
Okay, so yeah, and actually that would be more of a argument from authority, not a fallacious argument from authority, because presumably teachers know something about teaching and education, right? So you could have an appeal to authority in there. What else, though? I'm sure that you didn't just rely on your teachers telling you, hey, here's how the way it goes, because your teachers tell you a lot of things that you don't believe, right?
Common sense experience.
Okay, common sense. Now, where did that common sense come from? You weren't just born with it. How did you acquire what we call common sense with respect to this? What's that?
Learning from other people and their experience.
Ah, there's the key word, experience, right? And you're actually bringing up, I mean, what I was actually looking for was, well, you know, you watch other people, you see how they do. But it's also important that you learn from other people's specific experience. If all you've got to go by is your own personal experience, that doesn't cover an awful lot, does it? And the sign of an intelligent person is being able to benefit from not only their own experiences, their own successes, their own mistakes, but especially being able to derive benefit from other people's experiences and their successes and their mistakes. As a matter of fact, being successful in life is, in large part, not making the same mistakes as you see other people making, isn't it? You know, if you need to make the same mistake as somebody else before you believe that it's a mistake, your life is going to have a lot of road bumps, you know, along the way, isn't it? Or a lot of detours. So yeah, you're right. We have experiences, and then those are specific, aren't they? Let's say I watch all of you students. I'm a student in the class with you, and Mr. Weston studies, he does well. Ms. Richardson studies, she does well. And we go on all the way down, and then I look at some students and they don't study and they don't do well. Those are all specific cases, and I'm putting them all together and coming up with some sort of general rule, right? Some general conclusion. Now, there are special names for these. Your book gives you what it calls the inductive syllogism. And you've seen this word syllogism before in some of those handouts that I've given you. Syllogism is a type of argument. It's putting things together. The book talks about this on page 347. We're going to talk about that today, and then we're not going to talk about it afterwards, because we're more interested in the specific to the general. And your book calls this inductive generalization. Often we call this an inductive enumeration. Sometimes they switch the words and they call it an enumerative induction. And when you see that word, you know, enumerative or enumeration, what's the core of that word? Number, right? You're counting things up. And so numbers are involved, or statistics are involved, and we're going to talk a little bit about how to be a little bit more savvy with statistics. But so we're comparing and contrasting these two. Let's say we do it pictorially. In both cases, we have a group. And you're used to dealing with countless groups, right? You guys are a group right now. You're my class. Bless you. You're part of a much larger group, Fayetteville State University students, right? We can split you into other groups. We can talk about the women in the class and the men in the class. We can talk about the 3 people in the class who arguably, if we want to count, the current BDUs as green, say people wearing green as opposed to everybody who's not. Or we could actually split it into those who are wearing white, so 1, 2, 3, and we have 3 wearing black, 2 wearing gray, and then we'll put the other, no, 4, no, 3 wearing gray, and we'll put the other 2 in just other class, right? What have we done there? We've broken things down into groups, and you can take groups and split them into other groups, and you can put them together in bigger groups. Now, some groups you actually know a lot about. We know a lot about FSU students. Why is that? How do we know so much about you as a group? We actually know a lot about you individually, more than you'd probably want us to know. I've gone into Banner sometimes when students say, yeah, I can't understand why I'm doing bad in your class. I get all A's in my class, and sometimes I'll go in and look and, no, they're not. How do we know so much about you? Well, we have all sorts of data because you decided to enroll here. So you gave us a lot of information. So think about all the things that were required when you filled out your financial aid statements. What did they ask you about? What sort of characteristics or qualities? Your name, of course, so you get the financial aid, not somebody else. What else?
Sex, marital status.
Yeah, so we know how many women there are as opposed to men. We know how many of our students are married as opposed to unmarried, or did they ask a divorce or something like that on there? How many children? What else did they ask you about?
Income.
We know about income levels of our students from
Even
there.
your parents' income if you're young enough.
What else? There's more than that.
Um,
We know race, right? We know, not from the FAFSA forms, we know what your entering GPA was. We know what your SAT scores were on average. We can do all sorts of correlations. We can figure out...
where you went to high school.
That's true, yeah. We can figure out how many of our students are out of state as opposed to in-state, which counties in-state they came from. We have a lot of data on you. And so if we know something about the entire group, we can know something fairly well, fairly predictively, about the smaller part of the group. And so what we're doing with inductive syllogism is we're going from the larger group to talking about the smaller group. So let's think, for example, about sex and race, because those are the 2 statistics I actually know much about here at FSU. I don't know how many of you are foreign, or from other states, or from other counties, because I've never looked at that data. But let's ask, first of all, how many of you actually know what the proportion of men to women is here at FSU? Do any of you know it? Okay, so this is good. Let's do a guessing kind of game. Look around at this classroom. Would you say, and you all have to vote, would you say that this classroom is pretty representative of the proportion of men to women on FSU campus? Or would you say that it's not? So how many say yes? About, well, a little more than half the class. How many of you say no? Okay. So let's count it up. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 women, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 men. Actually, that's perfect. You know why? The proportion of women to men, students here at FSU, is 2 to 1. It's 66% female, which actually works out really well for the guys on campus, doesn't it? Because they have a lot more girls, or women, and possible mates, right? I don't know if that actually does translate to work out better for them. But yeah, this classroom is representative. A lot of times they're not. I don't know what it is about critical thinking classes, but very often they're not. So if we knew that 66% of FSU students are women, we could make a prediction about this classroom. We could also do it about the class down the hall. and we could go in there, and we could say, yeah, most likely, right, because it's inductive, most likely, because the group is this way, the parts are going to be that way. Do you think we could do that for every major? Once we start getting students in the majors, do you think there's some majors that are more male-dominated and some that are more female-dominated?
Yes.
Which ones do you think are more male-dominated?
Sports.
Sports medicine. That's interesting. I never thought of that one. We could, yeah, that would be good to check out. What else? What else do you think might be? What's that? Yeah. Because actually think about it, you know, in order to have more men, they'd really have to have a lot
Math
more men.
majors are more men.
Maybe. Yeah, that could be the case.
Computer science.
Computer science might be the case too, yeah.
ROTC.
What do you think?
Well, it's not really major, but
What's that?
the military.
Oh, ROTC. Yeah, I don't know. Do you know, Mr. Crawford? Are there more male students than female students?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so that's probably a good inference. But notice what we have to do if we want to know whether this is accurate. We've got to ask somebody who actually does know about that group, don't we? Although I suppose if we really want to know, we should probably go talk to the heads, right?
Biology, probably more men.
I don't know. I wonder about that. Which do you think have more women?
The arts.
Nursing.
Maybe. Yeah, nursing might. Although I know a lot of male nursing students.
Psychology.
Could be, yeah. I mean, actually, if you think about it, with 66% women, there should be at least some that are definitely, you know, majority women. Now, what about race? Let's look around this classroom and let's see if we think that this is probably typical proportions for FSU. How many of you say that this is a representative classroom?
Yeah, pretty much.
Well, raise your hands so I can see. Okay, how many of you think that this is not a representative classroom? So the majority think not. The proportions at FSU are about 70% African American, about 15% white, and then everything else is about another 15%. I don't know, this classroom looks about accurate. Perhaps a higher proportion of white students than we would expect, and a smaller proportion of everybody else than we would expect. Because we don't, as far as I know, unless some of you are multiple race, is there anybody here who's Asian?
Partially.
Oh, okay. Well, there we go. Then we're starting to fill it out. Anybody who's Native American? Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah. Okay. Actually, we're very close then to the normal FSU proportion. So you guys are a fairly representative class. I'll tell you one way you're not a fairly representative class. You're an 8 o'clock class, right? And what do we know about 8 o'clock classes? Not so much from looking at the whole of the university, but from our experience. What's that? No, go ahead. Ah, okay. What do we know about students in 8 o'clock classes?
There's not a lot of people.
What's that?
There's not a lot of people.
There's not a lot of people. There's less 8 o'clock classes than there are others. But you notice this class is just as full as any other class. So what else do we know about 8 o'clock classes?
They're more likely to pass.
They are more likely to pass. And that's an interesting feature, isn't it? Why do you think 8 o'clock class students are more likely to pass than the students next hour, just next hour, in the 9 o'clock classes? Yeah.
Because usually, like, the ones that are like striving usually get their classes in early because they like.
There's something, yeah, there's something about somebody who's willing to get up a bit earlier and be ready for an 8 o'clock class. They tend to do better because that correlates to being willing to put in the effort to study and to stay on track with the work and all of that. Actually, you guys show up on time more than any of my other classes. The 8 o'clock class, which you'd think about it, would be the one class where people would be like running late. They got to get going in the morning. This is the class where almost everybody's on time. My other classes, I would say that 1/3 of the class does not routinely show up on time. They'll show up 5 to 20 minutes late. Now, if you're doing that, can you be doing well in the class? Probably not. Now, we could do a study, and if we did a whole study, then we might be able to generalize about that. And then we might also be able to draw some conclusions and say, well, if you want to do better, start, going to 8 o'clock classes. You'll be part of a group that tends to do better. Now, on the other side, so if we know something all about an entire group, we can generalize about the parts. What about the cases that are much more common? Do we usually know all about a group? We don't, we know about FSU students, but do we know about students everywhere? I mean, there's probably data on everybody, but I don't know anybody who's compiled all that data. We do know actually quite a few things about American citizens in general, don't we? Because the census, it doesn't catch everybody, of course, because not everybody will fill out their census forms. And sometimes they send the interviewers, and sometimes the interviewers can't even make heads or tails of what the people are telling them. Or people lie, right? They've got 12 people living in their house, and they don't want anyone to know because it violates the code, so they say they only have 2 people. But for the most part, we do know about that. What are some areas where you don't really know? And if you had to get data on people, you would have a hard time doing it. But you would still like to be able to make generalizations. How about crime? Crime. Do we have... Think about some of the problems with crime. Can we possibly have perfectly accurate numbers? Why not? Some of you are CJ majors, right? What's that? Some don't get caught, right? Some, what's that? Yeah, so there's the issue of whether it's reported to begin with. And successful criminals, what makes them successful is not actually getting caught. So if we wanted to generalize about the criminals that we know are criminals, we would probably go to what, prisons? Or we would go to parole programs, halfway houses. But then we'd only be looking at the ones who actually typically get caught. Now, maybe it's the case that everybody gets caught after a while, but how would we actually know that? We can't look at them as an entire class like this. We can talk about the class that we do know, prisoners who've been caught and have been sentenced and went to prison. But if we want to generalize about things that we don't fully know about, what do? We go by a part of the group, and we say, well, we know something about this portion of the group. Now we're going to expand it to the entire group. And here it gets a little bit tricky, doesn't it? Because, and this is what we're going to talk about next time, how do you know that this is representative? Or how do you know that this is a large enough sample? Well, you can know in some cases. And we're going to talk about that. But in a lot of our cases, are they? I mean, we make a lot of, what's that? Assumptions, yeah. Or we come to snap decisions. Think about the mechanics of what we've talked about in the past, stereotyping. You get to meet, who should we pick on today? What group do you want to pick on?
President.
Okay, so presidents. Very small group. We're going to pick on presidents. So all of you have lived through. All of you have lived through about 4 or 5 presidents, right? Or maybe 3 or 4, because we've had a lot of 2-termers. So we've got Barack Obama, we've got George W. Bush, Bill Clinton. Who here was born, let's see, Clinton was elected in 92. Who here was born after 92? Okay, so you only have 3 presidents. And those of us who are longer, the first president I remember was Jimmy Carter. But I was actually born when Nixon was president.
Gerald Ford, right?
Gerald Ford lost to Jimmy Carter.
But he was president
Before him, yeah. And then,
You should remember him.
I don't remember him, because what I remember is Jimmy Carter beating him, because I was only 6 years old at the time. Well, you probably have a better memory than me. Things are very hazy for me. So, we're going to pick on presidents. Yeah, actually, if you only have those 3 presidents to judge by, you might have some pretty skewed views about what presidents are like, what political campaigns are like. If you're only judging from that small sliver that you get to see, that might not be that representative of this larger group. You want to make sure that that small sliver that you're actually selecting does adequately represent it. How would that group of 3 presidents be non-representative of presidents before them?
2 out of 3, no.
Now, how would that group be non-representative of presidents before them? When you think about race to begin with, right? There weren't any black presidents before Barack Obama, right? So the mere fact of containing a black member already makes it something that you couldn't, like, think back and say, well, I bet you, 1 out of 3 of our presidents beforehand were African American, could you?
Lincoln was.
Lincoln was African American?
I think he was part, yeah.
That, I'd have to see some evidence for that. But even still, I mean, how many presidents beforehand, the proportion would still be different. How else are they different? Did Clinton come from a rich family?
No.
No. Barack Obama didn't come from a rich family. George Bush did, right? His father, George H.W. Bush, was a Texas oil guy who actually came from the Northeast originally and then picked up a Texas accent. So 2 out of 3 came from humble beginnings. Can you really say that about the majority of presidents in our past? I don't think so. 2 out of 3 are Democrats, 1 is a Republican. Is that the case? I don't know. We'd have to think about that one. That one actually might be closer to being representative. Let's think about some other things. Where else do we poll people? Where else do we make generalizations based on only looking at a small sample that you can think of? Where do you do it? Because you do it. Guaranteed. Where do you engage in inductive enumeration? How did you decide to come here? Or how did you decide to go to college? Maybe some of you just sort of, well, your parents said you got to go. You're going to college, right? That's the case. How did you decide to go to college? What motivated your thought about that? Yeah.
I was taught that most people who go to college are successful.
Okay. So how do we know that? Have we actually looked at all successful people, or even most successful people? We look at a small proportion, and then we say, I want to be like that. What characteristics do those people have? And we generalize from that part. But even guys who've written books like that, 7 Habits of Highly Successful People, you guys are familiar with. If you're not familiar with that book, you probably should get familiar with that book, because that's a good book, and that guy turns out to be right. Those are habits of highly successful people. But did he look at everybody? He looked at a small portion, and then he generalized. Most of the studies that we do scientifically, do we test them on everybody? We actually only look at a very small group. How many of you are familiar? Here's an example of a study that's been way overused. How many of you are familiar with what's called the Milgram Prison Experiment? Any of you? Does this ring a bell?
Is that where they had one group of students be the guards and then the
Yeah.
other be the prisoners?
Is this starting to ring a bell now? They had one group of students, college students, I believe from Yale, and they created a make-believe prison, and they assigned roles to them. Some of them were the prisoners, and some of them were the guards. This was decades ago, and it's still being talked about today. How did it turn out?
They had us end it early, like 2 weeks early, right? Because
Yeah.
people were getting out of control.
They ended it after less than a week, actually. And who got out of control?
The guards.
Yeah. The guards severely abused their power, and it kept getting worse and worse and worse. And the experimenters were watching this, And at a certain point they said, oh, we got to pull the plug. And now this has been used to argue that, well, you know, power really does corrupt, and if you let people have authority over other people, they're definitely going to do that. They were generalizing about everybody. But, you know, I'm very suspicious of reasoning from these sorts of things. Because do you think college students in general are actually representative of the majority of, just say, Americans? Yeah, I mean, college students are actually still in formation, aren't they? They haven't actually figured it all out. They don't know exactly where they are. And some of them don't have a moral compass yet and probably will, you know, later on. So giving a bunch of college students, now imagine your fellow college students. Imagine you're in this prison experiment and you get to be a guard or you get to be a prisoner. Would you actually trust your fellow college students with that sort of power?
No.
Would you trust other people? Maybe. Exactly. Because hopefully, with age comes some degree of judgment and experience, and maybe we would give it to all the older college students, right? No? Well, there's a lot of scientific, in the broad sense, experiments that people do in psychology, in economics and social work, and they'll do it on a very, very small set. And they'll say, well, this proves that, and they're talking about an entire group. I just saw an interesting one in the Wall Street Journal that I'm writing about in my blog next week, where they talked about addiction. And they were looking at brain states, right? They map the brain, and they have people rewarded with the sort of things that they like, and then they have them think about it. And what they did is they took people who have food addictions, or just are at least intemperate with respect to food, and then they took people who are addicted to alcohol or cocaine or things like that. And what was kind of interesting is, you know, the same parts of the brain are being activated. And they're being activated whether they're enjoying the thing or whether they're just thinking about enjoying the thing. So what does this show us? That it shows us that, you know, maybe there's some sort of connection, even a physiological connection, between different types of addiction, right? The problem was, as somebody pointed out in the article, who did they actually test this on? Something like 40 women. Now, then the experiment starts to seem a little bit less generalizable. Maybe it has to do with women's brains and not so much with men's brains. I mean, I'm not saying that that's the case. I'm just saying we don't really know until we start experimenting on men in the same way. Maybe the physiology of female addiction is different than the physiology of male addiction. Again, we don't know until we actually start doing better data. I would like to see hundreds of people's brains being examined, and not just from one area, but from all over, you know, the world, if we were going to do this sort of thing and make generalizations. That would be a larger sample, as we call it, wouldn't it? They do this with other scientific things. When they test drugs, do they test them on everybody? You don't want to. Why not?
Because something go wrong.
Yeah, something goes wrong. Imagine, for example, there's a new drug out there to, let's pick something that it's going to work on something that's non-fatal, like arthritis, right? It's going to take care of arthritis. But let's say that, as it turns out, the drug kills 90% of the people that actually take it. Well, you would want to know that before you actually put it out there for general sampling, right? And let's say that they tried it on animals and there's something weird about our physiology. It doesn't interact with the animals, but it will kill 90% of the people. Well, then you really want to test it on a very, very small amount of people, don't you? Instead of releasing it to the general public and having them try it out. Now, what's interesting is you carry out this kind of reasoning all the time. Everybody around you does too. And it's not whether you do it or not, it's a question of whether we do it well. So that's part of what we're trying to focus on here is, what are the conditions for doing it well? With this one, it's pretty easy to say, isn't it? You actually have to know something about that whole group. So if you don't have accurate information about that whole group, let's say, for example, let's use stereotyping again. Let's say you only think that you know about an entire group. Again, let's say presidents. You know, What might be some funny ideas that people have about precedence that probably wouldn't apply to them, but somebody might get that idea. Think about what like a 6-year-old might make of the presidency right now. They might say, well, you got to be skinny to be president. And Barack Obama's skinny, right? Well, is that true?
To be a man, to be a president.
Yeah, that's a good example. All of the, sometimes we generalize, we take the group and then we push it off into the future, and what we're actually doing there, we think that we're working with this kind of reasoning, we're really working with this kind of reasoning. I mean, let's say the American Republic will be around for another 200, 300 years, right? We're going to have a lot of presidents. Have we actually observed all of them up to this point?
No.
We've maybe observed half of them, and they've all been men so far, but maybe that's not likely to continue as a trend.
So that would be an enumeration instead of a syllogism?
Yeah, that would be, because you're going from a part that you've actually been able to observe to the whole. If you've actually got information about the whole group and then you're generalizing about a part, then you're doing this inductive syllogism. So if you know all about, let's say you go and you get the statistics on, let's not use FSU students, let's talk about people who shop at Walmart. You know, Walmart presumably gathers information on the people who shop there, like what their preferences are, what they actually buy. That's why you have those UPC codes. That's so they can gather data. As a matter of fact, I don't know if any of you have these sort of things, like you know, the Harris Teeter one, and the Food Lion one. What else have I got? They get a lot of information on me. CVS, IGA, I have some library ones. Now all of these allow, Panera Bread, all these allow people to, every time they get scanned, they're gathering information on me as part of a group. Let's say everybody actually has one of these sorts of things. Then they would be able to gather information about the entire group. And when they see me walking in, they could say, well, we know that 95% of our patrons want this. Let's put that right in front of him. People make decisions based on these kinds of reasoning. We've done that at FSU with education. Here's a great example. How many of you are freshmen this year? Oh, a lot of you. Okay. How many withdrawals do you get? Total. 5. You get 5. Now, why did we come up with that? The previous students, they got grandfathered. They get as many withdrawals as they want. You guys are kind of unfairly put upon that way. Why did we come up with it? Was it just to screw with you? To add more burdens on you freshmen? We wanted to stick it to you, let you know who's boss. Is that what was going on? See some of you nodding and some of you shaking your heads. Well, why did we do it? Maybe we just did it on a whim. We said, what should we do? We need something different for the freshmen this year. Something that will make them, say, we're a different class. I know, 5 withdrawals. That's it. That's all you can have. We didn't do that either. We based it on information that we had about FSU students and students in general. Students who had more than 5 withdrawals almost never complete their college. So that's why we put the cutoff there. 4 withdrawals, yeah, a lot of them do complete it. 5 withdrawals, there it gets to the borderline. After 6 withdrawals, almost none of them complete college. So we said, well, you can only have 5 withdrawals so that you're not going to fall within that group. And we based it on knowledge about not just your class, but previous classes, going all the way back. And we based it not just on college students here, but college students at other places. You guys are a tiny part of that. So we were doing that so we could generalize about you, and then we could do it about further classes that come along the way. All right, so next class we're gonna answer the question, how do we know if this is any good? What are the criteria for figuring out whether this is a good inference or not?